Hi, I'm Todd Gannon, and this is the SCI-Arc channel. I'm here with Owen Moss, Director of Owen Moss Architects in Culver City and former Director of the Southern California Institute of Architecture. You came in as Director in 2002, but you'd been at the school from almost the very beginning. I think you started in 1973, the year after the school was founded, and you've been here ever since. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the place was like when you first got here and how it evolved.
Let me try to answer the question, of course, in a slightly different way, because the truth of the matter is that history apparently is written and rewritten, and not only the winners write the history books.
Right.
Because a lot of people have told this story and will tell it probably again and again, and probably more so as SCI-Arc builds on its successes. But I think it's an interesting topic, how SCI-Arc got to be what it is and where it might go in the future.
Well, what brought you here?
I worked for Pafford Clay, and then I went back to the GSD, which is Tongay and Joseph Candelas and Woods and Cert and Coleman and McKinnell, that group. In a way, I was listening to Tongay at the same time I was listening to Shadrach Woods, listening to ESO, not so much listening, but looking. So anyway, that was what was going on at the GSD. Then I left there, came back to LA. I knew a few of the people who were involved at the origins of SCI-Arc, and I came to teach. I don't think I ever had any intention of being involved in academia. It wasn't a goal, it wasn't an objective, and slid into it and met some people here that were of some interest. So that's, I guess, how I arrived here. And I had spent time at Cal Berkeley and at the GSD in an era of protests. One of the experiences that was important to me at that point was trying to figure out where I could fit. Like, should I go to class or should I go march? You know, things like that. And if I was marching, what was I marching for? And I think essentially the conclusion that I came to is I couldn't join either side, not because I didn't want to, whether I was a Republican or whether I was a Democrat or whether I liked the war in Vietnam. At a level of understanding, conceptual understanding, intellectual precision, that the discussion was sloppy as hell. And then what you find, and now you find it in an exaggerated way in contemporary America, that you're on my side and you're with God, or you're on the other side and you're with the devil. And what I continued to find, there were some legitimate pieces everywhere. Nothing necessarily strung them all together in an ideological way or in a doctrinaire way. So I don't think I could ever associate, you know, I'm a Republican or I'm an anarchist or I'm a leftist or something like that. And I think that forced me almost inevitably out on my own. Again, not because I wanted to go out there and be insular or isolated, but because there wasn't anything else to belong to. And I think that very much applied to architecture. And coming to SCI-Arc, and I think SCI-Arc in its initiatives made an effort to associate itself with those movements coming out of the 60s.
Those protest movements.
My interest in thinking about topics like this, but issues in general, is that if you can try to get back to the origins of things and understand why you associate your work with ideas that are handed to you and taught to you as reality. You want to be a radical contemporary architect, do this. Flat roof, ribbon window, pilotis, paint it white, Helvetica graphics, whatever it is. And what I'm interested in is the point in time before that argument or doctrine becomes an argument or doctrine.
Right.
After it becomes an argument or doctrine, and I think a lot of what is considered modern or LA modern, you can like the work, it's pretty, it's beautiful, it's a California version or whatever it is, but it's not ideologically, conceptually, intellectually very inquisitive. And I think part of the obligation of architecture to give back the culture to the next group who maybe aren't born yet, with a correction, what was left out, what should change, what's missing, what in the argument is fallacious. And you never get to the end of that discussion.
No, I always thought that the point of the pedagogy is that there's no pedagogy, was that questions are more important than answers.
It asks a lot of people. It asks people to come back to listen to what's around them. I mean, what I used to say here was, can you listen for things you haven't heard? Mm-hmm. Can you listen for a voice you haven't heard, or can you only hear what you were told to listen for? In other words, can you see it differently? And not only that, looking at work over time, can you understand why it is, what it is, when it is, mm-hmm. and what the particular affinities, intellectual affinities, technical affinities, political affinities, what those are at a particular point in time that attach people to those affinities. And I would say if there's a difference, that SCI-Arc, ideologically speaking, started out by saying, this is architecture. Mm-hmm. And when I left, it was more architecture, one architect at a time. I'm not saying it was ever either, but as a hypothesis, that would be my hypothesis. I always thought it was extremely important, even though it was a pain in the neck and didn't want to do it, to give the SCI-Arc rendition of what was coming in here. I don't know, so Pricks shows up. Or Patrick shows up, Pafford Clay shows up. Mm-hmm. That's nominally an interesting character. So you can present that. The job of SCI-Arc is not to dismantle everything that comes through, and certainly not to do it in a personal way, but in a conceptual way, that was the job, to introduce work with a perspective on the work, which gave SCI-Arc a position on everything in architecture in the world. It doesn't have to be me, but it needed to be somebody. It's important to try to continue to throw things out. Yeah. And that I would feel awful down here or down here if I felt that I belonged to a certain time. Whether I do or not, it might be for somebody else to say, but my aspiration would be not to belong to any time, not to belong to any place, and that would be a goal. So that by intention you would have to throw things out, and you couldn't keep reusing the same arguments because they were once valid in you or had a kind of truth that you could ascribe to. And I think that attitude was very much part of my sense of what SCI-Arc could be. I also know damn well that it's hard for institutions to sustain positions like that, because the word institution and sustain and position actually fit together in a certain way, meaning it works, keep doing it, why change it, instead of throwing it out. Because we threw a hell of a lot out of this school. Its organizational structure, its ownership structure, its relationship to the calendar, its dealing with money, a lot of topics which had run for a very long time and actually weren't operative, including an acknowledgement of the role of money in commerce and what would have to be done here to keep the lights on.
Maybe the most important accomplishment of your tenure was to kind of put the place right financially. I think that's something you maybe don't get enough credit for. Probably it's because it's a kind of institutional managerial thing as opposed to a pedagogical or disciplinary thing.
It's not only institutional, but part of the pro forma of the institution is that, in a way, money and commerce and administration are not substantive topics. And the real substantive topics are the conceptual topics about what architecture was or is and where it's going. I will never ever say that the administrative, organizational side of any institution is not somewhere in the discourse important, because to some extent, if you can't pay for it, they turn off the lights.
In some sense, that speaks to the fact that SCI-Arc has been kind of reinventing itself on a pretty regular cycle since it started. Part of the reinvention that took place when you were the director had to do with reshaping it from a kind of institutional, administrative, and fiscal point of view.
It's your job to evaluate.
Right.
It's not your job to repeat what somebody else's job was in a different context.
No.
Move the discussion.
And I know that, that has been a part of your mantra for a long time. And that was very much a part of your mantra as you were the director. I mean, you would kind of speak as SCI-Arc with that voice.
I'd like the subject itself to be talked about.
Yeah.
If there's a subject and if there's an argument for continuing to move the pedagogy or to self-critically re-evaluate.
On one hand, we have your advocacy for one architect at a time. Think it through, it's the individual responsibility. Through the years that you were at the helm, the school took on what I think, I'm not the only one, saw as a kind of consistency of look in certain of the studios. But there was a certain version of what you've called Pied Piperism going on here. And the school, for a time, started to be associated with a certain stylistic look. It started to look a little bit more like an academy. And I always wondered how you felt about that. Your line of argumentation and some of the work that was coming out of the studio, say around 2006, 2007, 2008, seemed to represent a slightly different attitude.
Here's the thing that I think is important. SCI-Arc is not my office.
Sure.
It's very different. I think I felt about a number of schools that I think produced interesting conceptual thoughts, that often they're directed by people whose real interest is somewhere else. I think the vanity of the process of running a school is removed from the job, in a way. From my vantage point, it wasn't so much that you couldn't have very strong characters. As long as there was a very strong critical opposition to that. I don't want to homogenize the discussion. I think that's the worst thing. But on the other hand, I don't want to orchestrate it. I was orchestrating the antithetical possibility all the time. I thought that would help intellectually for people to hear that Maya-ism or affinities or the form language that comes from software, or the associations with jellyfish, or whatever it was, were points of departure, but they weren't a religion any more than a triangle and a parallel rule and a flat roof and a ribbon window ever were. And they weren't in that context. The idea of taking down tradition or taking down what preceded you, McKim, Mead, and White versus Siegfried Gideon, and then saying, and now that one doesn't work, but this one does work, so don't do that, but do this. And I'm saying, but don't do that, but don't do this either. And some people can listen to that, and some people are susceptible to that, and other people aren't. And there are a lot of affinities that are part of the academic, intellectual, and even professional culture in terms of software ideas, in terms of prefabrication ideas. And if you look at who made the exhibits, and you look at the catalog of the exhibits that AADCU published, or you look at the lecturers, people who are coming in to lecture, people who are coming in to exhibit, people who are coming in to teach, you can say that there was a fair range. Not to dispute what you were saying. I think there were preferences and predilections.
Oh, for sure.
But I don't think it was ever homogeneous. It never bothered me.
I wanted to try to kind of tie these various threads together in terms of the question of relevance, right? I mean, I think what seems to be coming through in a lot of these answers and questions is that the school is kind of moving a lot, it's shifting a lot. It's reinventing itself periodically, sometimes partially, sometimes wholly. But it always is doing that in allegiance to a kind of mission that the school is going to stay right in the middle of the conversations, not conversation, but conversations that make architecture go now.
Well, I would say that you have to prove that. How is that confirmed? I mean, it's like the who says what architecture is discussion. I mean, to be in the middle of something means not only to show it or to perform it, it means to evaluate it, it means to critique it, it means to contribute to it. So if you're building either that or something antithetical, or if you're arguing it's not autopoiesis, it's Oswald Spengler or whatever it is, I think there will always be someone somewhere who is moving the discussion in a different direction. whether that's always SCI-Arc or not is an open question. I think the only thing we can do is to build in the intellectual tone and the openness, the hypothesis that this is the way to work, and that kind of world is the strongest world for people who are independent and imaginative and understand that the world will get different. And architecture can contribute to that difference if you're willing to do it, to take a step. But whether SCI-Arc is always in a position to do that depends on who's flying the plane. But that would be the goal, to keep SCI-Arc in that discussion. Frank and I had a discussion, and it's a good discussion, I think a legitimate discussion. One of the points somewhere in it had to do with what would make a radical architect or a radical school. And somewhere in going back and forth, there was the ability to separate oneself and to imagine. And then the capacity to invent not only the content, but the implementation means. I was arguing, and Frank said you left something out very critical, and he was completely right, which is the third one, which is get it built. Those three pieces, and they could apply in an academic context, they could apply in an on-the-street context. To be able to teach all three, that you're inventing conceptually, that you're inventing technically implementation-wise, and that you understand that the ultimate meaning for architecture is that it goes up on the street, that what we're talking about, what we're aspiring to, what we're pushing is build it. And if those voices remain at SCI-Arc, then I think SCI-Arc will remain a critical voice. One other thing, it seems to me that SCI-Arc uniquely very much belongs to personalities. I mean, you could say there are some other schools in the world that because of their institutional pedigrees and their resources, that they'll be interesting in one way or another, regardless maybe of the faculty and the director and all of that. The destination of SCI-Arc is very much contingent on particular individual voices, and they have to be powerful voices, and they have to be inquisitive voices, and they have to be opinionated voices. And then the quality of the voice and the quality of the opinion and the ability to get students and others to listen and learn, I think will tell you what the results are likely to be. It is very much a place that belongs to personalities. And that may be a strength, it may also be a weakness.
And so we could say invention, implementation, and personality. Eric, thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.